Welcome back to Talk Tickers, where we usually dig into all those earnings calls, the dense ones,
Yeah.
and kind of try to pull out the good stuff for you. But today we're doing something a little different. Still deep dive, but instead of financial statements and numbers and all that, we are diving into a breaking news story that has I'd say pretty much everyone in the marketing and data world kind of buzzing right now. The allegations that have been made against Zeta Global by Culper Research.
Yeah, this is definitely shaking things up, especially because, Zeta is such a big player
Yeah.
in the data-driven marketing space. They provide what they call a marketing cloud. So basically, consumer intelligence and software to help businesses better target their campaigns, get that data.
Right. So really all about connecting businesses with the right consumers using, all that data. But here's the thing, Culper Research, they're a short-selling firm. And that's important for our listeners to know right off the bat.
Oh, absolutely. Transparency is key, right? We got to acknowledge that potential bias from the start. But having said that, Culper is known for their super detailed reports. This one is no different, by the way. 27 pages, jam-packed with information. So we're going to try to, go through it all and help you understand what's what.
Exactly. We're not here to judge, whether Zeta is guilty or innocent or any of that. Our goal with this deep dive is to break down the claims, look at the evidence presented, and talk about why this whole thing is sending shockwaves through the industry, especially for anyone who, cares about ethical data practices and marketing.
Couldn't agree more. So let's start with Zeta's main business, how they make their money. Their whole model hinges on access to high-quality consumer data, right? And they've been very public about emphasizing fresh, opted-in data as their key advantage, what sets them apart.
Okay, so fresh data, meaning it's recent, and opted in. So we're talking about users who have given their consent. Can you explain why that's so important in this whole situation?
Sure. It boils down to the value of the data. In today's market, things change so fast. Having recent, accurate info about how consumers behave, what they prefer, that's gold. Outdated or inaccurate data, that just leads to bad targeting, wasted resources, and unhappy clients at the end of the day.
And this is where Culper's accusations become a real threat to Zeta's whole business. They're saying that a big chunk of Zeta's data is coming from what they call consent farms.
Yeah, basically websites that are designed to trick people into giving up their personal information. It's like a farm where instead of crops, they're harvesting data, but they're doing it through deception.
And Culper specifically calls out two of Zeta's acquisitions, APNIS and Archamax, as the main players in this whole operation.
Think about it. Websites that look like job boards, offering higher income jobs, or promising info about unclaimed money, stimulus checks, things that would be really tempting, especially now.
Oh, absolutely. People are struggling. They see that and they're going to click.
Exactly. Culper gives specific examples, too. One they highlight is higherincomejobs.com. At first glance, it seems legit, right? But you dig a little deeper and you find subdomains that are mimicking big companies like Amazon, FedEx, names you trust.
So you think you're applying for a real job,
But instead of an application, you end up down this rabbit hole. All these prompts for your data, name, email, phone number, maybe even financial info. It depends on the scheme. Culper points out the scale of this, too, how many people are getting caught. Similar web data shows 158.7 million visits to these sites just in the past year and 85.9 million unique visitors. This is not a small operation.
no, that's huge. But is all of that traffic definitely deceptive? I mean, couldn't some people actually be using those sites for real?
Well, yeah, it's possible, but Culper has more evidence than just the websites themselves. They mention a class action lawsuit that was filed against APNIS back in 2023, alleging deceptive practices. We don't know the settlement terms, but the fact that there was a lawsuit at all, that's not a good sign.
Definitely raises some red flags. And they also have this story about the father whose son got tricked by one of these sites. It's one thing to talk about data, in general, but when you hear a personal story like that, it really hits home how much this can hurt people.
Yeah, it's not just abstract anymore. And Culper's investigation goes even deeper. They say they've connected APNIS to around 40 different websites, all using these same tactics, the same shadiness. So that's one side of it, the APNIS side. But then you have Archamax, and they seem to be doing things a little differently.
Okay, so let's talk about Archamax. What are they up to that's raising eyebrows?
Well, they present themselves as a news aggregator, a site that curates articles from different sources, But according to Culper, this is just a front. It's all about getting your data. Once you sign up for their newsletters, that's when the real data grabbing starts.
Ah, the classic newsletter sign-up trick. I think we've all been there. You sign up for something that looks interesting, and then bam, You're hit with tons of emails and offers you never wanted.
Yeah, but this is worse than just annoying emails. Culper describes how Archamax basically bombards users with pop-ups, prompts, even when you say no to their offers. It's designed to frustrate you, and in the end, wear you down so they can get your data.
So they're relentlessly attacking your attention and your privacy. But how does Culper connect this to Zeta? I mean, this just sounds like normal, shady online marketing.
Well, here's the thing. A huge chunk of Archamax's traffic goes to two websites that were created. Get this, right after Zeta bought them. The timing is just too perfect, don't you think? It really points to a strategy of funneling users into these data traps.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong connection. So we've got APNIS allegedly running these deceptive job boards and lead generation sites, and then Archamax using the news aggregator thing as a cover to collect data.
Yeah.
But are these consent farms, as Culper calls them, are they unique to Zeta, or is this like a bigger problem in the whole industry?
That's the million-dollar question. And Culper actually compares this to a case from earlier this year involving a company called Fluent.
Right, Fluent. They got hit with that big FTC case in 2023, right? For using really similar tactics.
Exactly. The FTC accused them of running lead generation websites that tricked consumers, basically getting their personal information by lying to them. In the end, Fluent got fined and had to completely change how they collect data. It was a landmark case, really exposed the dark side of this whole consent farm thing. And what's really interesting is Culper quotes a former Fluent executive who basically said, I'm watching Zeta do the exact same things that got us in trouble with the FTC.
Wow, so someone who was on the inside at Fluent saw what got them punished and is now looking at Zeta and saying, hey, wait a minute, they're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
That adds a whole other layer to this. It's not just speculation anymore. Someone with firsthand knowledge is seeing a pattern here. But the big question now is, how big is this whole consent farm operation within Zeta? Is it just a small part of their business, or are we talking about a huge chunk of their revenue?
That's where things get really interesting and potentially really bad for Zeta. Culper has some estimates, and they're pretty eye-opening. They think APNIS is bringing in around $230 million in revenue, and Archamax is at $110 million. Plus, they add another $63 million that Zeta probably gained from Fluent's downfall, as companies look for other sources for that kind of data.
Okay, so if we add all that up, that's a potential $403 million consent farm business. Hold on, let me just grab Zeta's financials here.
Yeah.
Okay, so their reported EBITDA for last year was, wait, this can't be right.
What is it?
If Culper's numbers are right, this consent farm operation could be making up a whopping 56% of Zeta's EBITDA. Even if they're off a bit, that's a huge difference from the image Zeta tries to project, the whole ethical opted-in data company thing.
Yeah, it really casts doubt on their claims about ethical data sourcing. If most of their profits are coming from these shady practices, it undermines their whole value proposition.
And remember, that former Zeta employee we mentioned, the one who said APNIS and Archamax were projected to bring in over $300 million internally. That lines up pretty well with Culper's numbers.
Yeah.
It makes it seem like this wasn't just an accident, like they didn't know what these companies were doing. It looks more like a deliberate strategy to buy and use these consent farms for profit.
Yeah, intent is a big deal here. If it was an oversight, you could maybe argue it was negligence. But if they knew what they were getting into, and they went after these companies specifically for their data harvesting capabilities, that's a completely different story.
It goes from a, whoops, we messed up, to a, we knew this was shady and we did it anyway. But let's not forget, this deep dive isn't just about shady data collection. Culper also brings up concerns about Zeta's financial practices, specifically this thing called round tripping. To be honest, it sounds really complicated. Can you explain that for our listener?
Sure. Basically, round tripping is when a company makes it look like revenue is coming in. But it's actually just being moved back and forth between related parties. It's a way to artificially inflate their financial performance, make themselves look better than they are.
So it's like creating an illusion of growth. Why would a company do that?
It makes them look more successful, which can attract investors or boost their stock price.
Okay, that makes sense if you're trying to manipulate things. But Culper doesn't just throw that term around. They mention a specific case with a company called Kubient.
Right. Their CEO recently pleaded guilty to round-tripping fraud, and sources pointed to Zeta as the other party involved. Apparently, they were sending money back and forth, just to make it look like they had a real business relationship.
Uh-oh, that's not good for Zeta. What did they say about that accusation?
Their response was pretty weak. They said it was a small business relationship that ended in 2020, but the fraud supposedly happened before that. And to make it worse, Zeta's own auditor flagged this two-way contract issue as a concern. which kind of backs up what Culper is saying.
So we've got the possibly misleading data collection through consent farms. And now we've got concerns about financial manipulation. But Culper doesn't stop there. They also question Zeta's business partnerships, specifically who they're working with.
Yeah, this is where things get even more tangled. Zeta loves to brag about working with big, reputable enterprises. But Culper's report found a bunch of consent farm websites on their partner list. It suggests that Zeta might be knowingly profiting from these shady practices, even if they're not running the sites themselves.
So even if Zeta's core business is legit, are they turning a blind eye to where their data is coming from? Basically making money from these consent farms through third parties. That's still pretty ethically questionable.
Exactly. And Culper gives specific examples. One is Digital Media Solutions, or DMS, which filed for bankruptcy recently. Their bankruptcy documents actually named Zeta, APNIS, as a major customer, which implies a close relationship and maybe even a flow of data between them.
Again, that brings us back to the round-tripping concern. It makes you wonder, are these companies actually working together?
Yeah.
Or are they just moving data and money around to make their numbers look good?
It's a good question. And then you have Flatiron Media, the company behind the website Everyday Winner. They've been sued for violations of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA. That's the law about protecting people from unwanted calls and texts.
Oh, so those annoying spam calls and texts everyone gets. But what does that have to do with Zeta?
Well, Flatiron's managing director is a former CEO of Archamax.
Wow, this is getting complicated. Seems like everyone involved has some connection to this shady data business.
Yeah, it's a web.
Yeah.
And Culper also points to C4R Media. They were sued for similar TCPA violations. They were accused of using fake news stories to get people to visit websites that collected their data, and then they allegedly sold that data to companies like Zeta.
So even if Zeta isn't directly doing these things, they could still be benefiting from them by buying data from these shady sources. It really makes you question their ethics and their commitment to responsible data sourcing.
It does. It's easy to say you're committed to ethical data practices. It's a lot harder to actually do it, especially when you're talking about your whole supply chain.
Okay, so we've heard Culper's side of the story,
Yeah.
and it's not looking good for Zeta. But what does Zeta have to say for themselves? I mean, they must have responded to these accusations, right?
They have, and their response is basically a point-by-point denial of Culper's report. In a press release, they called the report misleading and categorically false. They insist that their data collection practices are completely legal and that their financial controls are strong.
Well, of course they would say that. But do they actually address the specific allegations? What about those consent farms and the deceptive websites?
They address some of the main points, like they clarified that their auditor is Deloitte, not Ernst & Young, like Culper said in their report. They also emphasize that revenue from customers who are also vendors, those two-way contracts that look like round-tripping, they said that's insignificant. And they pointed to their clean 2023 audit as proof that their financial controls are good.
Okay, so they're trying to address the credibility issue and the financial manipulation concerns. But what about the main problem? The tactics they're using on those websites. Did they explain how those job boards and unclaimed money offers are actually legitimate ways to collect data?
Not really. They mostly stuck to general figures. They said that the combined revenue from APNIS and Archamax is less than 3% of their year-to-date revenue, but they didn't break down those figures, and they didn't address the specific concerns about how they collected that data.
It sounds like they're trying to avoid the details. Like they're hoping those details will get lost in the big picture. It's not very convincing, especially with all the evidence Culper presented.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what they're hiding. Their response seems more focused on damage control than on being transparent.
And the market definitely seems to agree. Zeta's stock absolutely plummeted after the report came out. It dropped over 37% in one day.
That's a huge drop. It shows that investors are worried. And this whole case highlights how important reputation is in this industry. Data is the lifeblood of these marketing companies. If consumers, or the companies they work with, stop trusting their data collection practices, that could be the end of them.
Absolutely. This situation is a major reminder of how important transparency and ethical data use are, especially in an industry that depends so much on consumer information. It's not just about following the law, it's about building trust and respecting consumer privacy.
I totally agree. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Will regulators start looking into Zeta's practices? Will consumers demand more transparency? Will other companies in the industry rethink how they get their data? This case could be a turning point. It could force the whole marketing world to face the issue of ethical data use.
We're definitely in uncharted territory here. This isn't just about money, it's about ethics, privacy, the future of data in a digital world.
It's a conversation we all need to be having. As data becomes more and more valuable, the potential for abuse grows. We need to be careful about how our information is being collected and used, and we need to hold companies accountable for their actions.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. Data is everywhere, it's valuable, and the rules are still being figured out. The Zeta situation brings all of that into focus. But before we go too far down that road, I want to hear from you, the listener. What has stood out to you the most in all of this? What do you find most compelling or concerning? Think about that for a minute. Because now we're bringing in someone who can help us understand the legal and regulatory side of this whole data privacy debate.
Great idea. We've been looking at the Zeta Global situation from a financial and investigative perspective, but to really understand what could happen, we need to hear from someone who's on the front lines of data privacy law.
Someone who can give us insights into how the regulations are changing and the challenges companies face when trying to balance innovation with ethical data practices. So joining us today is a leading expert in data privacy law and a strong advocate for consumer rights. Please welcome guest name, a partner at law firm name, and a recognized thought leader in the field of data privacy.
Guest name, thanks so much for being with us on Talk Tickers.
It's great to be here. This Zeta Global case is definitely a hot topic right now, and for good reason. It brings up so many crucial issues that are at the forefront of the data privacy world.
We're excited to hear your perspective. To start us off, could you give our listeners a quick overview of the current data privacy landscape? What are the key laws and regulations that companies operating in this space need to know about?
Sure, it's a complex and constantly changing landscape. In the US, unlike Europe, we don't have one federal privacy law. Instead, we have a bunch of state laws, each with its own quirks and requirements.
That sounds like a nightmare for companies trying to operate across the country.
It can be. Some of the most important state laws include the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. That law was a game changer. It gave consumers a lot more control over their personal information.
And we've seen other states follow California's lead, right? Virginia, Colorado, Utah. They've all passed their own privacy laws recently.
Exactly. The trend is definitely towards stronger consumer privacy protections. And companies need to be ready to adapt and comply with more and more regulations.
But even with these state laws, it seems like there are still gaps, loopholes that companies can exploit. The FTC case against Fluent showed us that, right? Companies can find ways to operate in a gray area, doing things that might not technically break a specific law, but are still deceptive and harmful to consumers.
That's true, unfortunately. And that's where the FTC's enforcement power comes in. They have a crucial role in policing the industry and holding companies accountable for unfair or deceptive practices. Even if those practices don't technically violate a specific law, it's about making sure that companies operate in a transparent and fair way. When it comes to consumer data,
So, from a legal perspective, do you think the FTC has a strong case against Zeta Global based on what we know so far?
it's too early to say for sure. The investigation is just starting. But the accusations against Zeta are very similar to the Fluent case, which the FTC took very seriously. The idea of consent farms, tricking consumers into giving up their data under false pretenses, is at the heart of both cases. And that's something the FTC has made it clear they won't tolerate.
Especially if Zeta knew about these practices and still decided to buy and profit from companies doing them, like Culper alleges. If they had that level of intent, it's going to be hard for them to claim ignorance or to argue that it was just a small part of their business.
Exactly. If they were aware of these practices
Mm.
and still chose to buy and use these consent farms, it's much harder to defend their actions legally.
We've been talking about state laws and the FTC, but what about the possibility of a federal privacy law? Is that something that could happen soon? Could it change the game for companies like Zeta?
It's definitely possible. And it's something that a lot of privacy advocates have been pushing for. There's growing support in Congress for a federal privacy law that would create a more consistent standard across the country.
And that would probably mean stricter rules for data collection and use, right? A higher bar for what counts as valid consent, greater obligations for companies to protect consumer data, and maybe even harsher penalties for violations.
Most likely, yes. A federal privacy law would aim to establish a basic level of protection for consumers in every state, and that would probably lead to stricter standards and more accountability for companies handling personal information.
So this Zeta Global case could actually be a catalyst for bigger changes in the industry. It's shining a light on the problems with the current system and putting pressure on lawmakers to do something.
I think you're right. This case has gotten everyone's attention. And it's highlighting the need for stronger privacy protections. It's a wake-up call, not just for Zeta, but for the entire data-driven marketing industry.
It's also a reminder that consumers need to be more proactive about protecting their own data. We can't just rely on laws and regulations. We need to be informed and take steps to safeguard our own information.
Absolutely. What are some practical tips our listeners can use to protect their data online? What are the red flags to watch out for?
There are a few things you can do. First, be careful about what you click on and what information you share online. If a website or an offer seems too good to be true, it probably is. Those win a free iPad pop-ups are usually just trying to get your data, not give you a prize.
We've all seen those. It's tempting to click, but you got to resist.
Right. You should also take the time to read privacy policies, even though they can be long and boring. Pay attention to what data they're collecting, how they're using it, and whether they're sharing it with other companies. And don't be afraid to change your privacy settings on social media and limit the data you share with apps. You have more control than you might think.
And there are tools like ad blockers and
Yeah.
privacy-focused browsers that can help reduce data collection too, right?
Absolutely. And if you think a company has misused your data, don't hesitate to file a complaint with the FTC or your state attorney general. Your voice matters. And reporting these violations helps hold companies accountable.
It's about taking back control of our digital lives. We need to be informed, proactive, and demand better from the companies that handle our data.
Well said. Guest name, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. This has been a really valuable conversation.
It was my pleasure. I hope this case leads to positive change in the data privacy world.
I think it will. This is a story that's not going away. We'll keep following it closely and let our listeners know about any major developments.
In the meantime, we encourage everyone to check out the sources we've talked about today and form their own opinions. The links to Culper's report, Zeta's response, and other relevant information will be in our show notes.
And as always, we want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. What does this case say about the data-driven marketing industry as a whole? Is ethical sourcing becoming the new battleground? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Zeta Global controversy. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about how your data is being used, the better you can protect yourself. We'll see you next time on Talk Tickers.
And it really put Zeta in a tough spot. I mean, someone who was right there at Fluent saw everything that went down, and now they're looking at Zeta and going, hang on a sec, haven't we seen this before?
Right. It's like, this isn't just some random guess anymore. Someone who knows this world inside and out is spotting a pattern. But the big question now is just how much of Zeta's business is tied up in these consent farms? Are we talking about a little side hustle, or is this a major chunk of their revenue?
That's where things get really interesting and maybe really bad for Zeta. Culper has some numbers, and they're not pretty. They think APNIS is bringing in something like $230 million in revenue, Archamax another $110 million. And then on top of that, they figure Zeta probably scooped up another $63 million just from Fluent's mess, companies looking for someone else to get that kind of data.
So quick math here. That's potentially a $403 million consent farm business. Hold on, let me pull up Zeta's financials. Okay, their EBITDA last year was, no way, this can't be right.
What is it?
If Culper is even close to accurate, this whole consent farm thing could be making up 56% of Zeta's EBITDA. Even if their numbers are off a bit, that's a huge gap between this and the image Zeta's been pushing, the whole ethical data company, all that.
Yeah, it definitely throws a wrench into their whole ethical data sourcing claim. If they're making most of their profit from these shady tactics, what does that say about their whole value proposition?
And remember that former Zeta employee we talked about, the one who said internally, APNIS and Archamax were projected to bring in over $300 million. That lines up pretty well with what Culper's saying. It makes it look like this wasn't just some oops, a mistake. It was a calculated move to acquire these companies and use those consent farms to rake in the cash.
Intent is everything here. If it was an accident, maybe you could say it was negligence, they slipped up. But if they knew exactly what was going on and they went after these companies because of their data harvesting operation, that's a whole different ballgame.
It goes from oops, our bad to we knew it was shady and we did it anyway. But we're not done yet. This deep dive isn't just about shady data collection. Culper also raises concerns about Zeta's finances, specifically something they call round tripping. Honestly, it sounds like something out of an accounting textbook. Can you break that down for our listeners?
Okay, so round tripping is essentially making it look like you're getting all this revenue, But really, you're just shuffling money back and forth between companies that are connected. It's a way to artificially inflate your numbers, make yourself look more successful than you actually are.
So it's like faking growth. What's the motivation for doing that?
Well, it can make a company look more attractive to investors, pump up their stock price, that sort of thing.
Okay, so it's a way to manipulate things. But Culper doesn't just throw this term out there. They bring up a specific case involving a company called Kubient.
Right, their CEO just recently pleaded guilty to round-tripping fraud. And sources pointed to Zeta as the other company involved. They were supposedly sending money back and forth just to create the illusion of a legitimate business relationship.
Yikes, that doesn't sound good for Zeta. What's their side of the story on this one?
Their response wasn't very convincing, to be honest. They claimed it was a small business deal that ended back in 2020, but the alleged fraud took place before that. And here's the kicker. Zeta's own auditor flagged this two-way contract issue as something to watch out for, which kind of gives Culper's claims more weight.
So we've got the possibly misleading data collection through these consent forms, and now we've got concerns about financial shenanigans too. But Culper doesn't stop there. They also start digging into Zeta's business partners, specifically who they're choosing to work with.
This is where things get really messy. Zeta loves to talk about working with these big, well-known companies, very respectable. But Culper's report found a bunch of consent form websites on their partner list. It suggests that Zeta might be making money off these shady practices, even if they're not directly running the sites themselves.
So even if Zeta's core business is legitimate, are they turning a blind eye to where their data is coming from, making a profit off these consent forms through third parties? Ethically, that's still pretty questionable.
Exactly. And Culper provides specific examples, too, like Digital Media Solutions, or DMS. They recently filed for bankruptcy. And their bankruptcy documents actually name Zeta, APNIS, as a major customer, which implies a close relationship, and maybe even some data flowing between them.
That brings us right back to the round-tripping issue. Makes you wonder if these companies are actually working together, or just shuffling data and money around to boost their numbers.
It's a valid question. And then there's Flatiron Media, the company behind the Everyday Winner website. They've been sued for violating the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA. That's the law about protecting people from unwanted calls and texts, all that spam.
Those annoying calls and texts everyone gets. But how does this connect to Zeta?
Well, Flatiron's managing director is a former CEO of Archamax.
Oh, wow, this is getting tangled. Seems like everyone involved has some tie to this questionable data collection world.
It's a web, for sure. And Culper also highlights C4R Media, another company that got sued for TCPA violations. They were accused of using fake news stories to drive traffic to websites that were harvesting data. And then they allegedly sold that data to companies like Zeta.
So even if Zeta isn't directly involved in these shady tactics, they could still be profiting from them indirectly by buying data from these questionable sources. It really raises questions about their due diligence and commitment to responsible data sourcing, you know?
It does. It's one thing to talk about ethical data practices. It's another to actually live by them, especially when you consider your whole supply chain.
Right, it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've heard Culper's side of things, and it's not a pretty picture for Zeta. But what does Zeta have to say about all this? Surely they've responded to these serious accusations, right?
They have. And their response is basically a point-by-point denial of everything Culper's saying. They put out a press release calling the report misleading and categorically false. They insist that they're following all the rules when it comes to data collection, and that their financial controls are rock solid.
Well, yeah, that's what you'd expect them to say. But are they actually addressing the specific allegations? What about the consent farms and those deceptive websites?
They touch on some key points, like they clarify that their auditor is Deloitte, not Ernst & Young, which is who Culper mistakenly said it was. They also stress that revenue from those two-way contracts, the ones that raise red flags for round-tripping, they said that's a tiny part of their business. And they pointed to their clean audit for 2023 as proof that their finances are in order.
Okay, so they're trying to address the credibility and the financial manipulation stuff. But what about the core issue here, the tactics they're using on those websites? Did they explain how those job boards and unclaimed money offers are actually legitimate ways to collect data?
Not really. They mostly relied on broad numbers. They said that combined, APNIS and Archamax make up less than 3% of their year-to-date revenue. But they didn't give us any details about those figures. And they didn't address the concerns about how they got that data in the first place.
It feels like they're trying to dodge the specifics, hoping the details will get lost in the bigger picture. It's not very convincing, especially when you consider all the evidence Culper presented.
It does make you skeptical, doesn't it? Their response seems more about damage control than real transparency.
And the market seems to agree. Zeta's stock took a nosedive after that report came out. It plunged over 37% in a single day.
Wow, that's a big hit. Investors are clearly worried. And this whole situation shows just how fragile a company's reputation can be in this business. Data is everything for these marketing companies. If consumers, or the companies they work with, lose trust in their data collection practices, that could be devastating.
Absolutely. This case is a stark reminder of how important transparency and ethical data use are, especially in an industry that relies so heavily on consumer information. It's not just about following the letter of the law, it's about building trust and operating in a way that respects consumer privacy.
Couldn't agree more. And it'll be fascinating to see how this unfolds. Will regulators start looking into Zeta's practices? Will consumers demand more transparency? Will other companies in this industry rethink their own data sourcing? This case could be a watershed moment, a real reckoning with ethical data use in the marketing world.
We're definitely in uncharted territory here. This is bigger than just a financial story. It's about ethics, privacy, the future of data in our digital lives.
It's a conversation we all need to be having. Data is becoming more valuable every day, which means the potential for abuse is growing too. We need to be vigilant about how our information is being collected and used, and hold companies accountable for what they're doing.
Yeah, it really feels like we're at a turning point here. Data is everywhere, it's valuable, and the rules are still being written. This Zeta situation really brings all of that to the forefront. But before we get too deep into that, I want to hear from you, the listener. What stood out to you the most in this whole story? What do you find most interesting or most concerning? Take a second to think about that, because now we're bringing in someone who can help us understand the legal side of things, the whole regulatory landscape around data privacy.
Great point. We've been looking at the Zeta Global situation from a financial and investigative angle. But to really grasp the potential consequences, we need to hear from someone on the legal front lines, someone who's dealing with data privacy law every day.
Someone who can shed light on how the regulations are changing and the challenges companies face trying to balance innovation with ethical data practices. So, joining us today is a leading expert in data privacy law and a fierce advocate for consumer rights. Please welcome guest name, a partner at law firm name, and a recognized thought leader in the field of data privacy.
Yes, Name, thanks so much for joining us on Talk Tickers.
It's my pleasure to be here. This Zeta Global case is definitely generating a lot of buzz, and for good reason. It touches on so many crucial issues that are at the heart of the data privacy world right now.
We're eager to hear your perspective. To kick things off, could you give our listeners a brief overview of the current data privacy landscape? What are the key laws and regulations that companies operating in this space need to be aware of?
Sure, it's a complex and constantly evolving landscape. Here in the US, unlike Europe, we don't have a single federal privacy law. Instead, we have a patchwork of state laws, each with its own nuances and requirements.
That sounds like a real headache for companies trying to do business nationwide.
It can be. Some of the most important state laws include the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. That was a game changer in terms of giving consumers more control over their personal information.
And we've seen other states follow California's lead, haven't we? Virginia, Colorado, Utah.
Yeah.
They've all enacted their own privacy laws recently.
That's right. The trend is definitely towards stronger consumer privacy protections. And companies need to be prepared to adapt and comply with this growing number of regulations.
But even with all these state laws in place, it seems like there are still gaps, loopholes that some companies might try to exploit. The FTC case against Fluent demonstrated that, right? Companies can find ways to operate in this gray area, engaging in practices that might not technically violate a specific law, but are still deceptive and harmful to consumers.
Unfortunately, that's true. And that's where the FTC's enforcement authority comes in. They play a vital role in policing the industry, holding companies accountable for unfair or deceptive practices. Even if those practices don't explicitly break a specific law, it's about making sure companies are operating in a spirit of transparency and fairness when it comes to consumer data.
So putting on your legal hat for a moment, do you think the FTC has a solid case against Zeta Global based on what we know so far?
It's still early to say definitively. The investigation is just getting started. But the allegations against Zeta are strikingly similar to the Fluent case, which the FTC took very seriously. This whole concept of consent farms, tricking consumers into giving up their data under false pretenses, that's central to both cases. And it's something the FTC has made it clear they won't tolerate.
Especially if Zeta knowingly acquired and profited from companies engaged in these practices. as Culper is alleging, that level of intent could make it very difficult for them to claim ignorance or argue that it was just a small, insignificant part of their business.
Exactly, if they were aware of these practices and still chose to acquire and utilize these consent forms, it becomes much harder to defend their actions from a legal perspective.
We've been talking about state laws and the FTC, but what about the possibility of federal privacy legislation? Is that something that's on the horizon? Could it be a game changer for companies like Zeta?
It's definitely a possibility, and a lot of privacy advocates are pushing for it. There's growing momentum in Congress to pass a federal privacy law that would create a more uniform standard across the country.
And that would likely mean stricter requirements for data collection and use, right? A higher bar for what constitutes valid consent. More obligations on companies to protect consumer data, and potentially harsher penalties for violations.
Most likely, yes, a federal privacy law would aim to create a baseline level of protection for consumers across all states. And that would probably lead to stricter standards and increased accountability for companies handling personal information.
So this Zeta Global case could actually be a catalyst for broader change in the industry. It's shining a spotlight on the flaws in the current system and putting pressure on lawmakers to take action.
I think that's a valid point. This case has captured the public's attention, and it's highlighting the need for stronger privacy protections. It's a wake-up call, not just for Zeta, but for the entire data-driven marketing industry.
It's also a reminder that consumers need to be more proactive about protecting their own data. We can't just rely on laws and regulations. We need to be informed and take steps to safeguard our own information.
Absolutely. What are some practical tips our listeners can use to protect their data online? What are the red flags they should be watching out for?
There are several things you can do. First, be mindful of what you're clicking on and what information you're sharing online. If a website or an offer seems too good to be true, it probably is. Those win a free iPad pop-ups are often designed to collect your data, not to actually give you a prize.
Yeah, we've all seen those. It's tempting to click, but you have to resist.
Exactly. You should also take the time to read privacy policies, even though they can be long and complicated. Pay attention to what data they're collecting, how they're using it, and whether they're sharing it with third parties. And don't be afraid to adjust your privacy settings on social media platforms. And limit the data you share with apps. You have more control than you might think.
And there are tools like ad blockers and privacy-focused browsers that can help minimize data collection, right?
Absolutely. And if you believe a company has misused your data, don't hesitate to file a complaint with the FTC or your state attorney general. Your voice matters. And reporting these violations helps to hold companies accountable.
It's about taking back control of our digital lives, being informed, being proactive, and demanding better from the companies that handle our data.
Well said, guest name. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. This has been an incredibly valuable conversation.
It was my pleasure. I truly hope this case serves as a catalyst for positive change in the data privacy landscape.
I think it will. This is a story that's not going away anytime soon. We'll continue to follow it closely and keep our listeners updated on any major developments.
In the meantime, we encourage everyone to check out the sources we've discussed and form their own opinions. You'll find links to Culper's report, Zeta's response, and other relevant information in our show notes.
And as always, we want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. What does this case say about the broader data-driven marketing industry? Is ethical sourcing becoming the new battleground? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Zeta Global controversy. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about how your data is being used, the better equipped you are to protect yourself. We'll see you next time on Talk Tickers.